I stood at the edge of the gravel road, watching the heavy diesel exhaust from a flatbed truck drift over my late wife's oak grove. The morning air in Knox County usually smells like damp earth and fresh-cut hay this time of year. But today, it smelled like hot hydraulic fluid and cheap asphalt. Two men in neon vests were unloading wooden survey stakes from the back of a pickup, hammering them into the soil right where Evelyn used to plant her summer sunflowers. I didn't yell. I didn't wave my arms or make a scene. When you spend 40 years as a civil surveyor, you learn early on that shouting never shifted a property line an inch. Lines don't care about your feelings, and they certainly don't care about how loud you can raise your voice. They only care about where the steel pins are driven into the bedrock. I stepped off the porch, walked down the driveway, and stood quietly by the mailbox, watching them work. Before I tell you my story, please leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you're new here, welcome to the channel. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm 68 years old, and for more than 4 decades, I was the man the county called when two neighbors were ready to tear each other's fences down over 3 inches of topsoil. I spent my career with a brass transit scope on my shoulder, stepping through brambles, reading old deeds written in fountain pen from the 1940s, and finding truth buried under 30 years of overgrown grass. It's quiet work, surveying. It teaches you to look past what people say and pay attention to what the paper proves. 3 years ago, my wife Evelyn passed away. We had 41 years together on this 40-acre farm outside Mount Vernon, Ohio. When she died, a part of this house went dark. The rooms felt too large, the barn felt too quiet, and the gravel driveway seemed longer than it used to be. My daughter, Clara, wanted to help. She was 34 then, working as an accountant town over, married to a commercial real estate broker named Greg Lindell. Greg was 38, wore suits that cost more than my first tractor, and spoke in the kind of rapid-fire corporate jargon that makes you feel like he's trying to sell you something, even when he's just asking for the butter. Arthur, Greg had told me at the kitchen table 3 weeks after Evelyn's funeral, leaning back in his chair with his hands folded behind his head. You're pushing 70. Running 40 acres of cropland and maintaining the homestead isn't practical anymore. Let Clara and me handle the operations. We'll bring in commercial tenants, manage the crop leases, and take the burden off your shoulders. You just sit on the porch and relax. I didn't need to sit on the porch and relax. I was grieving, not invalid. But Clara looked at me with her mother's soft hazel eyes, her forehead creased with concern, and I made the mistake so many fathers make when their hearts are heavy. I conceded. I signed an operational management agreement, allowing Greg to handle the agricultural leasing and day-to-day property maintenance. I kept the deed to the entire 40 acres in my name, of course, but I gave them free rein to manage the lower field along State Route 13. To Greg, that agreement wasn't a gesture of trust from a grieving father-in-law. To Greg, it was a surrender. Within 6 months, the tone in my own house began to shift. It started small. Greg would drop by on weekends, looking over my shoulder as I cleaned my hand tools in the shed. "Still using those manual calipers, Arthur?" he'd say with a dry little chuckle, tossing his car keys in his hand. The modern real estate world moves on satellite telemetry and digital mapping now. Nobody reads old handwritten ledgers anymore. That stuff belongs in a museum. I just wipe down the steel blade with an oiled rag and keep working. I didn't tell him that satellite telemetry misses legal easements buried in county archives. I didn't tell him that software doesn't know who cleared the timber in 1952. I let him think I was just an old man clinging to obsolete habits. Then came the subtle exclusions. When regional farming representatives came to discuss crop rotation, Greg held the meetings in his downtown office without telling me. When county maintenance crews came to clear the drainage ditches, Greg spoke to them at the gate, referring to the farm as the Lindell Estate Project. Clara tried to keep the peace, but Greg had spent 6 years convincing her that his ambition was the only thing standing between them and mediocrity. She started looking at me not as her father, the man who had built her tire swing and paid off her college tuition without taking a dime of debt, but as a frail, stubborn obstacle who was holding her husband back. "Dad," she said to me one Sunday evening, stepping into the kitchen while Greg waited in his car outside, engine idling. "Greg is trying to secure our financial future. He's talking to some big regional investors. You need to stop asking so many questions every time he brings property paperwork over. It makes him feel like you don't trust him." "I trust paper, Clara," I said quietly, setting my coffee cup down. "Paper doesn't change its story depending on who's sitting across the table." She sighed, shook her head, and walked out. Which brings me back to this morning. The two workers in neon vests were driving bright pink plastic flags into the grass along the gravel lane. That lane, a 60-foot wide strip of crushed limestone, was the only access point connecting the front 5 acres of our property directly to State Route 13. Without that lane, those front 5 acres were completely cut off from the public highway, bordered on the north by swampy creek bottoms and on the east and west by dense timber owned by the State Forest Service. I walked across the damp grass toward the surveyors. The younger worker, a kid no older than 25 with a clipboard tucked under his arm, looked up as my boots crunched on the gravel. "Morning, sir," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove. "Can I help you?" "I was about to ask you the same thing," I said, my voice steady and low. "You're driving stakes in the private property." The kid checked his clipboard, flipping through a set of freshly printed blue-line blueprints. "This is Parcel B of the Vance Lindell subdevelopment. We're marking the boundary perimeter for Apex Resort Holdings. Preliminary site preparation starts next week." Apex Resort Holdings. Tim Caddick. I looked at the blueprint in his hands. There it was. A clear, professional subdivision layout dividing my late wife's 5-acre frontage parcel into a commercial resort plaza, complete with a proposed 80-room hotel site, parking facilities, and an expanded entrance road right over my gravel driveway. At the bottom of the map, in the client authorization block, was Greg Lindell's signature, bold and sweeping, right above the printed text, "Authorized to State Manager and Primary Property Representative." My name was nowhere on the document. "Who gave you authorization to enter this field?" I asked Dap. "Mr. Bunda Greg Lindell," the kid replied, pointing his thumb toward a black sedan idling down by the main highway. "He told us the senior owner was retired and wouldn't be involved in the survey work. Said we had full clearance to stake the frontage easement." I looked down at the bright pink flag fluttering near my boot. Taped to the wooden stake was a handwritten survey note in Greg's handwriting. "Commercial Development Access, Route 13 Corridor." He hadn't just listed the land date. He had already signed a commercial development agreement behind my back. He believed that because I had granted him agricultural management rights, I was too old, too tired, and too clueless to check the public land registries or notice the survey crews on my own front lawn. He thought he had turned 40 years of my life's work into his personal multi-million-dollar payout. I didn't pull the stake out of the ground. I didn't shout at the workers. I leaned down, carefully read the coordinate numbers Greg had scribbled on the pine wood, and then looked back toward my house. Beyond the main farmhouse sits an old wooden tool shed, a structure I built with my own hands back in the summer of 1996. Beneath the workbench in that shed, resting inside an airtight steel box, sits a leather-bound, hand-drawn farm ledger from 30 years ago. Greg thought he was playing a modern real estate game. He thought a few high-priced lawyers and digital maps gave him the right to erase my presence on this earth. What Greg didn't know, what he had never bothered to ask, was what was written on page 14 of that 1996 ledger. I turned my back on the survey crew, pulled my coat collar up against the morning wind, and began walking slowly toward the tool shed. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the quiet hum of the country road was broken by the aggressive purr of a high-end V8 engine. I was sitting on the front porch, oiling the hinges on Evelyn's old porch swing, when a metallic white Lexus SUV pulled into the driveway. It didn't drive up the gravel lane at a respectful speed. It kicked up a cloud of white dust, rocks pinging against the underside of the floorboards until it ground to a halt right in front of the flower beds. Greg stepped out of the driver's side. He wore a navy-tailored blazer over an open-collar shirt, his leather loafers gleaming in the afternoon sun. He didn't just walk toward the house, he strutted, tossing a heavy silver key fob from his right hand to his left. Clara came out through the screen door behind me, wiping her hands on an apron. When she saw the vehicle, her face didn't light up with excitement. It tightened. "Greg," she said, her voice dropping into that careful, strained register a woman uses when she's trying to manage a husband who moves too fast. "What is that?" $85,000 of momentum, sweetheart, Greg said, stepping onto the porch and kissing her cheek without making actual eye contact. He turned to me, nodding toward the gleaming SUV. "What do you think?" Arthur features 21-inch alloy wheels, panoramic glass, and adaptive air suspension. The dealership in Columbus delivered it 2 hours ago. I rubbed the oil rag over the steel hinge in my lap. "Looks like a heavy vehicle for a gravel road. Greg, what did you trade in for it?" "Trade in," Greg laughed, a sharp, barking sound that made the birds in the maple tree flutter. "I didn't trade in anything. I put 10 grand down from the preliminary earnest funds on the Apex deal and financed the rest through commercial corporate credit. When you're structuring a 7-figure land acquisition, you don't arrive at the closing table in a 4-year-old pickup truck. Image is leverage, Arthur. You ought to know that, even if your idea of leverage was a pair of work boots and a steel measuring tape." Claire looked between the two of us, her fingers clutching the fabric of her apron. "Greg, the earnest money from Apex. I thought those funds were supposed to stay in escrow until the municipal board verified the site access." "The site access is a formality," Greg snapped, his tone shifting instantly from boastful to dismissive. "I spoke to the development team this morning. They're driving the perimeter stakes right now. We have dinner with their senior acquisition director, Marcus Vance, no relation, thankfully, at 6 o'clock tonight in the main dining room. I had a catering crew bring in prime rib and wine." He looked down at me, taking off his sunglasses and tucking them into his breast pocket. "Make sure you wear a collared shirt, Arthur. Marcus is used to dealing with high-level executives, not retired county workers. I want this evening to look seamless." I didn't answer him. I just folded my oil rag, set it on the side table, and stood up. Dinner was served at 6. Greg had hired a local catering company to transform my late wife's oak dining table, the table I had built from fallen timber after the storm of '92, into a corporate showroom. White linen tablecloths, crystal wine glasses, and silver cutlery covered the hand-carved grain that Evelyn used to wax every spring. Marcus, a thick-set man in his 50s with silver hair and a gold watch that caught the chandelier light, sat to Greg's right. Clara sat across from him, quiet, barely touching her salad. I sat at the head of the table, not because Greg wanted me there, but because it was my chair, and I sat in it before anyone could suggest otherwise. For 45 minutes, Greg dominated the room. He talked about density calculations, commercial tax abatements, and traffic corridor projections. Every time Marcus asked a specific question about the land's historical boundary lines or soil drainage, Greg brushed it off with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry about the dirt, Marcus," Greg said, refilling the investor's glass with a $100 Cabernet. "The dirt is just the canvas. What we're selling here is the footprint. 40 acres of prime Knox County frontage right off the state route." "Actually," I said, setting my water glass down with a soft clink against the wood, "the frontage parcel is only 5 acres. The remaining 35 acres are designated agricultural land under the 1996 County Conservation Framework." The dining room went entirely still. "Mine." Marcus lowered his fork, looking at me with mild interest. "Is that right? I was under the impression the entire parcel was zoned for mixed commercial use under the management agreement." Greg's face flushed a deep mottled red. His jaw worked silently for 2 seconds before he let out a dry, forced laugh that rattled his wine glass. Arthur has a hard time keeping up with modern zoning updates. Marcus, Greg said, his voice dropping into an ugly, patronizing cadence. He worked for the county back in the days when people drew maps with pencils and carbon paper. He forgets that old paperwork gets overridden by current commercial filings. He turned his body fully toward me, leaning over the table, his eyes narrow and sharp. Let's be completely honest here, Arthur. You've had a good run on this farm. 40 years of pulling rocks out of the dirt and pretending it's a kingdom. But you're 68 years old. You spend your afternoons sitting in a shed with rusty tools while Clara and I manage the reality of keeping this family financially afloat. Clara reached out, her hand trembling. Greg, please. No, Clara, let me finish, Greg said, standing up from his chair to command the room. He looked down at me like a landlord addressing a delinquent tenant. Your father needs to hear this. He's clinging to land he can't maintain, holding up a deal that secures our entire financial future. In fact, Marcus, Clara and I were just discussing this morning that once the Apex deal closes and the construction begins, it won't be practical or safe for Arthur to live on site with heavy machinery moving back and forth. He smiled a cold, empty smile that reached nowhere near his eyes. We've already looked into several assisted living communities over in Newark. Beautiful places, professional staff, medical oversight, structured activities. It's time for Arthur to step aside, give up the management burdens, and let the professionals handle the estate. He was telling me, in front of a complete stranger at my own wife's table, that he was taking my land, spending my money, and putting me in a nursing home. Marcus looked slightly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Clara looked down at her plate, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin, silent line. She didn't defend me. She didn't tell him he had gone too far. She just sat there, terrified of losing the lifestyle her husband had promised her. But I sat very still. Inside my chest, 40 years of patience didn't turn into anger. It turned into iron. It turned into the cold, clear precision I used to feel when setting a transit scope on a winter morning, looking through the glass, cutting through the fog, and finding the exact line where the truth sat. So I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped softly against the floorboards. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't knock over a glass. I didn't make a speech. Enjoy your dinner, Marcus, I said quietly, looking the investor in the eye. It's a fine piece of beef. I turned, walked out of the dining room, and stepped through the back door into the cool evening air. The farm was dark now. The sky turned a deep indigo over the oak trees. I walked past Greg's gleaming $85,000 Lexus, down the gravel path, to the small wooden tool shed at the edge of the lower meadow. Inside, the air smelled of cedar shavings, 3-in-1 oil, and dry earth. I turned on the single overhead bulb hanging from a brass chain. I walked to the back of the shed, knelt down on the pine floorboards, and pulled aside the wooden crate where I kept spare mower blades. Underneath was a square trap door, secured with a brass padlock. I pulled the small key from my ring, unlocked it, and lifted the door. Inside the recessed steel box lay an old leather-bound ledger, its dark brown cover worn smooth at the edges from 30 years of handling. Stenciled across the front in faded black ink were the words Vance Estate, Boundary and Easement Logs, 1996. I lifted the ledger out, set it on my workbench beneath the yellow light, and opened the cover. What? I flipped past the hand-drawn maps of the North Pasture, past the soil surveys from '94, until my thumb settled on the thick, yellowed edge of page 14. I didn't turn on the overhead light in the tool shed right away. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the crickets in the lower pasture and the distant hum of traffic on State Route 13. Through the trees, I could see the warm glow of the farmhouse windows where Greg was still laughing with the resort representative, pouring more expensive wine and celebrating a fortune built on land he didn't understand. I turned the brass switch on the desk lamp, Warm yellow light spilled across the worn oak workbench. I opened the leather-bound 1996 ledger to page 14. The ink was 30 years old, slightly faded at the edges where my fingers had rested back when Evelyn and I were still young. But the handwriting was unmistakable. It was my own block lettering, clean and precise, drawn with a surveyor's technical pen. There, neatly mapped out in India ink, was the exact survey diagram of the front 5 acres. But underneath the grid lines was the clause I had spent 3 days drafting before the county recorder stamped it back in August of 1996. Access to Parcel B frontage corridor is granted strictly under a conditional agricultural right-of-way via the central gravel lane. This easement remains valid solely while the land is utilized for family agricultural production. Any attempted commercial subdivision, third-party conveyance, or non-agricultural development shall automatically and permanently revoke all ingress and egress rights across said lane, reverting sole control of the access corridor to the primary deed holder. I ran my thumb over the official red ink seal at the bottom of the page. Knox County Recorder's Office, Volume 412, page 14. Greg knew how to read a modern online tax map, but he had never stepped foot inside the basement archives of the Knox County Courthouse. He didn't know that 30 years ago, before digital databases existed, farmers in Ohio routinely wrote access restrictions directly into the underlying land ledgers to protect their families from predatory developers. He thought he had bought a gold mine. In reality, he had just signed a contract to deliver a landlocked island surrounded by land he couldn't legally cross. At 7:15 the next morning, before the summer sun had even cleared the tree line, I pulled my old Ford truck out of the driveway. I didn't say a word to Clara or Greg. I drove 12 miles south into downtown Mount Vernon. The Knox County Courthouse sits on the square, a gray stone building with high stone steps and brass doors that have been pushed open by generations of men who built things with their hands. I walked down the basement hallway to the recorder's office. The air down there smells the way it has for 50 years old paper, floor wax, and dry coffee grounds. Sitting behind the high oak counter was Miller. Beacon. Miller is 62 years old, wears heavy reading glasses tucked on a cord around his neck, and has spent 34 years maintaining every deed, plat, and boundary dispute in Knox County. We had worked together on hundreds of property surveys back when I was the chief county inspector. "Arthur," Miller said, looking up from a stack of ledger volumes and lowering his glasses. "You're in early. Everything all right out on Route 13? "Morning, Miller," I said, setting my old leather ledger on the counter between us. "I need a historical verification on volume 412, page 14. Miller looked at me for a long second. He didn't ask a dozen unnecessary questions. When you've known a man for 30 years, you don't need speeches to know when something serious is on the table. He swiveled his chair, walked back into the high-ceilinged vault where the physical records are kept, and pulled down the heavy canvas-bound master ledger from 1996. He laid it flat on the counter beside mine, flipping through the yellowed pages until he reached page 14. He read the entry silently. Then he pulled out a magnifying glass, checked the clerk's initialing, and looked up at me. "The ink's been dry 30 years, Arthur," Miller said softly, his voice dropping into that quiet, respectful tone men use when they recognize ironclad work. "It's indexed correctly. It was never modified or superseded by any subsequent filing." "I know," I said, "and right now, a commercial broker named Greg Lindell is trying to close a $1.2 million resort deal on that frontage parcel without an access right." Miller let out a slow, dry breath. "Greg Lindell. Your son-in-law." "My daughter's husband," I corrected gently. "I need to file the formal notice of easement termination based on commercial breach, effective immediately." Miller didn't hesitate. He pulled a standard county enforcement affidavit from the drawer, laid it on the desk, and handed me a pen. "If I stamp this, Arthur," Miller said, looking me straight in the eye, "no vehicle, no construction crew, and no commercial buyer can step foot on that gravel lane without you personally opening the gate. Apex Resort won't be able to move a single wheelbarrow of dirt onto that property. I know, I said. And, I said, I signed my name at the bottom of the affidavit. The ink was dark black, clean, and steady. Miller took the document, placed it under the heavy steel county seal, and pulled the handle down with a sharp, heavy clack. No, he stapled a certified copy inside a blue filing jacket, stamped the official red time verification mark on the front, and handed it across the counter. It's filed, Arthur, Miller said quietly. As of 8:45 this morning, Parcel B is legally landlocked. If anyone tries to cut that gate or drive heavy machinery across your lane, the sheriff's department has a direct court mandate to impound the equipment on the spot. Thank you, Miller, I said. Don't thank me, Miller replied, leaning his elbows on the counter. You built the boundary 30 years ago, Arthur. I'm just keeping the record straight. I tucked the blue filing jacket under my arm, walked out of the courthouse, and stepped out onto the sunlit steps of the square. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Greg, sent to a group chat that included Clara and 3 senior project managers from Apex Resort Holdings. Site prep begins at 10 a.m. today. Contractors arriving with heavy excavators to clear the driveway lane. Arthur, make sure the front gate is left unlocked. Big day for the family. I looked at the screen for 3 seconds. I didn't reply. I didn't type an angry message. I didn't try to explain the law to a man who thought money made him immune to it. I put the phone back in my pocket, walked down to my truck, and turned the key. By 9:30, I was back at the farm. I pulled my truck up to the front entrance of the gravel lane, right where the pink survey flags were still fluttering in the morning breeze. I got out of the cab, walked over to the heavy steel gate that Evelyn and I had hung 30 years ago, swung it shut across the driveway, and snapped a heavy brass master lock through the chain. Then I pulled my wooden folding chair out of the back of the truck, set it down under the shade of the big white oak tree right beside the gate, and sat down with a thermos of black coffee. The sun was high in the Ohio sky now, warm and clear. Across the pasture, I could see Greg's new white Lexus parked near the house, its chrome trim glinting in the light. I took a slow sip of coffee, set the thermos on the grass, and waited. In 10 minutes, the heavy machinery would arrive. In 10 minutes, Greg's 7-figure dream would collide headfirst with page 14. And for the first time in 3 long years, I sat in the shade of my own trees, completely at peace. At 9:58, the rumble started. It wasn't a single vehicle. It was a convoy, a massive flatbed transport carrying a 20-ton Caterpillar excavator rolled down State Route 13, followed by 2 tri-axle dump trucks and a black corporate SUV with the Apex Resort Holdings logo emblazoned on the door. The flatbed slowed down, air brakes hissing loudly as it swung wide to make the turn onto my gravel lane. It stopped 5 feet short of the heavy steel gate. Marcus Vance stepped out of the black SUV, wearing a hard hat over his silver hair. Right behind him was Greg, jumping out of his white Lexus, holding a rolled-up set of site plans under his arm like a general reviewing a battlefield. Greg marched toward the gate, his face red with irritation when he saw my truck blocking the driveway and me sitting in my wooden folding chair under the oak tree. "Arthur!" Greg shouted, waving his hand impatiently. "What are you doing? I texted you 2 hours ago to leave the gate open. Move your truck and unlock the chain. The contractors are on the clock at $150 an hour." I didn't get up from my chair. I set my coffee cup down on the grass, looked Greg in the eye, and spoke softly. "The gate stays locked, Greg." Greg let out a sharp, disbelief-filled laugh, looking back at Marcus as if to say, "See what I have to deal with." "Arthur, stop playing games," Greg said, stepping right up to the steel bars of the gate. "I hold the commercial management authority for this property. I signed the development lease with Apex. You don't have the legal standing to block a commercial transit corridor." "I don't need to block it," I said quietly, reaching into my coat pocket and pulling out the blue filing jacket Miller had stamped an hour ago. The county already did. I stood up, walked slowly to the gate, and slid the certified copy of the easement termination through the steel bars directly into Marcus's hands. "What is this?" Marcus asked, frowning as he opened the blue cover. "That," I said, "is a certified transcript from Knox County Record Book 412, page 14, registered in August of 1996. It grants a conditional agricultural right-of-way across this gravel driveway. Subsection C specifies that any commercial conveyance or third-party development automatically and permanently revokes all access rights across this lane." Marcus's eyes scanned the page. I watched the color drain from his face, replaced by the sharp, cold calculation of a man who realized he had been handed a catastrophic liability. "Is this valid?" Marcus asked, turning his head slowly toward Greg. "It's 30-year-old garbage," Greg yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "It's an outdated farm ledger entry. My management agreement overrides any historical personal filings." "A management agreement doesn't override a recorded property covenant." "Mr. Lindell," a new voice called out. A Knox County Sheriff's cruiser pulled up behind the dump trucks, its yellow caution lights flashing. Deputy Miller, my friend Miller's nephew, stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his belt. He walked up to the gate, looked at the paper in Marcus's hands, and then turned to the flatbed driver. "Turn those trucks around," the deputy said calmly. "This driveway is private property. The access easement has been formally revoked under county court order. If any heavy machinery crosses that line, I'm impounding the equipment for criminal trespass." The flatbed driver didn't hesitate. He climbed back into his cab, tossed his gloves onto the dashboard, and began backing the massive rig out onto the highway. Marcus turned on Greg, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that carried clearly over the idling engines. "What? You told us you held full, unencumbered transit access to State Route 13, Marcus said. "You sold us a landlocked parcel, Lindell. Do you have any idea what kind of breach of contract you just committed?" "Marcus, wait. We can petition the board. We can file an emergency injunction," Greg stammered, his hands shaking as he dropped his rolled-up blueprints into the mud. 4. "Apex is pulling out of the agreement immediately," Marcus said coldly, pulling off his hard hat. "Our legal department will be serving you with a demand notice for the return of the earnest deposit by 5 o'clock today, along with a formal claim for $250,000 in liquidated damages for contractual misrepresentation." Marcus got into his SUV, slammed the door, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over Greg's spotless leather shoes. Greg stood alone at the gate, staring at the empty highway. His face was ghost white. The $250,000 penalty, combined with the earnest money he had already spent on his new Lexus, meant absolute financial ruin. He turned toward me, his hands clutching the iron gate bars, his eyes wide with desperate rage. "You ruined me," he screamed, his voice breaking. "You destroyed my career. You destroyed Clara's future, all over a stupid piece of dirt." I looked at him through the steel bars. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt the immense, quiet clarity of a man who had finally drawn a line where it belonged. "I didn't ruin you, Greg," I said softly. "You sold land you didn't own, to buy a car you couldn't afford, to impress people who don't care about you. Your own greed built the trap. Page 14 just locked the door." Clara's car pulled up along the gravel shoulder. She stepped out, looking at the flashing police lights, the tire tracks in the mud, and her husband standing defeated in front of the locked gate. She looked at Greg. Then she looked at me, sitting under the oak tree with my old leather ledger resting on my lap. For the first time in 3 years, the haze of Greg's manipulation seemed to clear from her eyes. She saw the truth not just about the land, but about the man she had allowed to disrespect her father. She didn't offer Greg a ride. She walked past him, opened the small pedestrian gate, and sat down on the grass beside my chair. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears as she looked toward the oak grove where her mother's sunflowers used to bloom. I forgot where we came from. It's all right, Clara, I said, putting my arm around her shoulder. The boundary is still right where it belongs. Within 3 weeks, the white Lexus was repossessed from the driveway. Greg faced an avalanche of legal judgments that forced him out of the real estate sector entirely, and Clara filed for divorce before the summer was over. As for me, I still live on those 40 acres outside Mount Vernon. Every morning, I sit on the porch with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the lower meadow. The gravel lane remains quiet, crushed limestone leading out to the public road, wide open for my family, and permanently closed to anyone who thinks dignity can be bought and sold. Which leads me to ask you, do you think Arthur was right to enforce page 14 and let Greg face the full legal consequences? Or should he have given his daughter and son-in-law another chance? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts.